Welcome to Reflections, where we focus on specific subjects to figure out what's what and to take you along for the journey. I'm Jeffrey van Leeuwen, and in this podcast we're going to be focusing on something that is very near and dear to my heart: video games. In this episode I'll focus on what video games can be, and hopefully we'll delve into some aspects of video games that you haven't perhaps thought about yet. We're going to talk a bit about my personal history with video games, a game in particular that had a big impact on me and in some indirect way might even be responsible for the existence of this podcast. I don't want to spend too much time on promoting video games in a story that is aimed at convincing you why video games will be either good or bad, or what they can teach you in terms of skills, as there's more than enough out there about that. Sure, we'll talk a little bit about skills that I picked up over the course of my video game career, but it's not the primary focus of this episode. Instead, what I want to give you is an overview of my personal experience with video games, based on around 30 years of experience with them. I'll tell you how they entered my life, what they have done for me, and what avenues of opportunity they have managed to open up for me. I'll be as honest and transparent as I can, and will mention both the good and the bad wherever this is relevant, including a moment where I made a major mistake that for a long time I thought I would actually never recover from. So, again, this episode is not to convince you whether video games are good or bad. I'll leave that completely up to you. Instead, this is my story in video games. With all of that in mind, let's get started. Okay, so where does one even start with a subject like video games? I won't go too much in the history of the industry itself, but what I will say is that for me it started in the mid-90s as a young kid. While I don't really remember when my first real exposure to a video game happened, a good friend of my parents had a computer that I could sometimes use when we visited them. It was one of those very old plastic computers that, when newly purchased, would be white and cream colored, but slowly would turn into more like a yellow beige color over time. When we were there, I was allowed to sometimes use that computer and would use it to draw pictures, or to color in some line drawings of dinosaurs and other things as well. I also remember very vividly that as a 5-year-old kid, this same person gave me his old computer. He saw the interest I had in computers back then and figured I could use one of my own to play around with. That computer had the operating system Windows 3.1 on it. Now, for everybody watching and listening who has no idea how old Windows 3.1 is, that is a lot of generations of Windows ago. That's before Windows 11, before 10, before 8, even Windows 7, Windows Vista, Windows XP, and even before Windows 95. Windows 3.1 was released in 1992, a year after I was born. And since I was 5 at the time when I got that computer, it must have been either 96 or 97. And man, when I got that computer, I was so excited, to the point where I would just stare at it from my bed, and I couldn't sleep because I was just so hyper-focused on that magical new machine that was just waiting there on the opposite side of my room, ready to be turned on. This magical new machine, which by the way didn't have any access to the internet, something that by then wasn't mainstream at all, was able to run some amazing games that completely absorbed just about every corner of my consciousness. I was so proud of it. I had my very own computer. What could be better than that? Everything about it was just so incredibly novel, and in my mind the possibilities were just endless. Everything was possible. Man, I wanted to use it so bad, but if my parents found out I was using it in the middle of the night, way after bedtime, that dream was going to end really quickly. So yeah, no secretly using the computer in the middle of the night. But when I did get the chance to use it, there was no holding me back. I tinkered with everything I could find. All the settings, every single application. I opened up every single folder I could find until there was nothing, absolutely nothing left on that machine that I didn't know about. And if we just freeze here for a bit. A very important point I want to make here is that to me personally, the ability to fully explore a computer was something that I was highly interested in. And because of that interest, there was deep engagement, which then led to a very deep and almost constant learning. Whenever I found something I didn't understand and couldn't figure out myself, I made sure to remember the question so that the next time this friend of the family came over, I could ask him about what got me stuck that day. Because of his experience in IT, he obviously knew way more than me as a young child, and he helped me figure out the problems I was encountering back then. I made sure to remember every single word he would tell me, and to practice it straight away. One particular issue that really stands out to me was the idea of copying files from a floppy disk to the computer. And if my memory serves me well, you couldn't just drag and drop the file, but you had to give the computer very specific commands, which are lines of code telling the computer exactly what to do. I'm not sure if there was a simpler way back in the day, and there probably was, but I remember that this was the method on how to copy files from one place to the other. Maybe he just wanted to give me a challenge, I don't know. But it was fun nonetheless, and it introduced me very early on to the concept of using logic and issuing commands to a computer in order to make stuff happen. The reason why I'm pointing this out so early in this episode is because I really believe that deep engagement like this is incredibly important to people, especially to young children. I think there's no better way to learn than with playful exploration, because it's something you actually care about and are incredibly interested in. I'll spend some more time in this podcast episode talking about this, but I believe it's absolutely fundamental to understand. In order to learn optimally, you need to be engaged in a state of playful exploration. But okay, back to the story. And let's get into some actual video games. Somehow a couple of video games found their way onto the computer, and I believe most of them were on floppy disks that were just laying around. For anyone unfamiliar with floppy disks, they are these flexible square magnetic storage devices. And in my case, they were these 3.5-inch ones that could hold not more than 1.44 megabytes of data. Now, can you imagine that? In the current day and age, where we almost don't even deal with megabytes anymore, because purchasable storage is measured in gigabytes and terabytes, back in that day, stuff could still be measured in kilobytes and in megabytes. Okay, and just to quickly put it in perspective, you would need around 350,000 of those tiny floppy disks to have the same amount of storage as a simple 500 gigabyte drive that you can buy today for around $50 or euros over here in Europe. I hope this gives you an idea that the word gigabyte in that time was almost non-existent, at least when it was about home computers. But even though these humble floppy disks were only 1.44 megabyte in size, they weren't just storage devices. They were the gateway to a world of video games that would completely captivate my imagination and lighted a fire to seek out all sorts of wonderful experiences. They introduced me to classics like Commander Keen, Prince of Persia, God of Thunder, and Wolfenstein 3D. Games that captivated my young imagination and ignited my passion for gaming. These games, called MS-DOS games, because they were built to run on the Microsoft disk operating system, so MS-DOS for short, are these classic games with retro aesthetics that often had very simple and pixelated graphics due to the very limited graphic capabilities of computers back then. The sound was often very basic, with synthesized music and sound effects. And the games themselves were pretty straightforward in their design, yet they were incredibly engaging. I mentioned, for example, Commander Keen, which was a classic platforming game, where you could go from left to right, had to evade all sorts of objects and enemies, and collect stuff along the way that you needed in order to complete levels. And you also had a pogo stick you could use to make some pretty high jumps wherever that was needed. But you also had games like Wolfenstein 3D, which used some clever rendering techniques to simulate 3D visuals. And that technique was called raycasting, as real 3D back then didn't really exist for MS-DOS games. But still, it allowed the player to roam this seemingly 3D environment to fight enemies. And back then, that was incredibly cool. One of the most fun things at that time was that the video game market was still very much a niche market. Games were very much for the quote-unquote nerds. And a normal person, and once again I'm using air quotes here, No normal person played these things. It wasn't just as straightforward to launch them either, like it would be today. You wouldn't just go to the App Store and download your favorite game of the store. In that time, you had floppy disks, and those had games on them. Similar to how you now go to a store and buy a physical copy, for example, of a PlayStation or an Xbox game. But you had to put those disks in a floppy reader, and sometimes use the command prompt to launch or even copy the game. Not always, but sometimes that was needed. And just in case you're wondering what a command prompt is, if you've ever seen a movie or a series in which you see a hacker typing some super fancy commands into a screen and then all of a sudden, poof, magically he hacked a bank or something like that. Well, that is the command prompt, although obviously with a little bit of a Hollywood touch. Regardless, playing games at that time demanded some very hands-on techniques, and it was great fun to learn how to use the command prompt as well, which some years later caused a little bit of trouble at school as I wrote a little script just for fun that would run in the background and expand itself endlessly, with the idea that the computers would run out of storage. And it was also a playground to play around with some malware back then, but hey, just for legal reasons, we won't go any deeper into that little piece of naughtiness. A year or two after I got that first computer, another computer entered the house. And this time it was a computer for my parents. A brand new and beautiful Windows 95. It looked completely different than the machine that I had. And its interface was a lot more refined and a lot more detailed as well. At one point, my father started playing a game called Warcraft 2, and I was watching it. The moment I saw that game, it blew my mind. I went from playing these old MS-DOS games like Commander Keen and God of Thunder over and over and over again to seeing a game as beautiful and as complex as Warcraft 2. And for those not familiar with Warcraft 2, think of Lord of the Rings in terms of having humans and orcs fighting each other, but you had to build your base, train workers and soldiers, make sure you had the proper defenses like a watchtower, and use your soldiers to attack the bases of the enemy. It was way more complex than anything I've ever played before, and once again, I got immediately obsessed by the sheer complexity of this wonderful new game, the beautiful colors and the details of the graphics and the sound. It had music that was way more complex. It wasn't as blocky as what I played before, and it just looked like a lot of fun. You could even build ships and go on the water. What I would really like to emphasize is that this was also the first moment that it became clear to me that a video game could provide wonderful and deep stories. With every new title I played, I began to see layers of narrative woven into the gameplay, stories that went far beyond simple entertainment. I realized that these games had the power to evoke real emotion, challenge my perspectives, and transport me to richly crafted worlds. And great examples here are games like Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, and Resident Evil. Thinking about this time when I was a very young child, it brings back a lot of memories. Video games were just so beautiful. You could really feel that the games got mechanically more complex over time, and there were just so many amazing experiences waiting out there. One specific memory that really stands out is that I was saving months of pocket money, and it might even have been half a year or something like that, to talk my father into driving me to the local mall to buy Pokemon Yellow Edition. And the whole trip, my father must have gone absolutely mad from this 9-year-old telling him non-stop about all the details of what you could do as a Pokemon trainer. Everything I absorbed from watching another kid in the neighborhood play the game himself. So there was all this build-up excitement in me to finally being able to play it myself. There was just no stopping the flood of information smashing its way into my father's ears. You had Pikachu walking behind you the whole time. You could catch any Pokemon you want, and you could train them, and you could make them fight, and you had these gym balls to defeat, and you had to become the champion by defeating the Elite Four at the end of the game. Man, I was relentless. There was no stopping it. My poor father probably laid awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, still hearing the echoes of his son bouncing around in his mind, telling him all about Pikachu. But he was a gamer as well. So I think he understood the enthusiasm. At the house we had different consoles, but most importantly we had a Nintendo 64, which had some amazing games like Super Mario 64 on it, which was the first 3D Super Mario ever made. It was a lot of fun. The goal was to save the princess, who once again managed to get herself kidnapped by this big angry turtle called Bowser. And you had to enter the princess's castle to collect enough stars in order to become strong enough to face Bowser himself. And in order to do that, you had to go to these different rooms in the castle, and each room had a painting hanging in it. And you could jump into the painting in order to enter the world of that painting. Every world then had its own theme. Some were full of lava, others were full of ice, and others were more of these tiny mini-games where you had to do a certain challenge, like flying around through a bunch of floating circles in order to reach that beautiful golden star that you knew was waiting for you once you've completed the challenge. Then you heard a little victory tune, Mario would do his victory pose, the camera would zoom out, and then Mario jumped out of the painting in the castle again, and then you could try another painting. But alright, so before I bore you too much with hundreds of different stories I have about all kinds of different video games, let's just take a little step back. This was a bit of a nostalgic introduction to the episode, and I enjoyed that a lot. But let's talk a little bit about how video games were not just entertainment, but catalysts that gave me the opportunity for deep playful learning through real engagement, but also how they provided an opportunity to build very real skills, through a passion that later would also lead me down a path of seeking out profound storytelling, which to some degree in the long run might even be one of the reasons for the existence of this podcast. So let's take Super Mario 64 as an example. That game is super interesting from a design standpoint. Running around in that game felt a little bit like moving underwater. To move Mario forward, you gently nudged the control stick forward, but he wouldn't just instantly burst into full speed immediately. Instead, he had a brief moment of, let's say, charging up, that made it feel like moving underwater, but just for that second, just for that beginning second. And then you had to use all the other buttons as well, to punch, to jump, to crawl, and to use a combination of these buttons to make far jumps or keep jumping with very precise timing in order to make higher jumps. The physics in the game were very interesting, and you had to be quite precise as a player. Especially in later levels this became really important, as the levels became much harder than the earlier ones. But to make a long story short, Mario's moving around pretty sluggishly, which gave it an element of unpredictability. And as a player you had to compensate for this by being very precise in your timing and in your movement and the combination of buttons that you used. If you've never played any video games, this might seem trivial, but keep in mind that most controllers nowadays usually have 2 control sticks, around at least 12 buttons, so 4 on the right side, 4 on the top side, the start button, the select button in the center, and usually you could also press the control sticks, so those served as buttons themselves as well. And playing a game means constant engagement with all of this, and then making combinations with all of those buttons all the time. And think about this for a second. Your left thumb is usually the finger that will control movement in a video game. Your right thumb is usually the finger that controls the camera. Playing games means training your fingers to do things that usually they would never do. I mean, when in history have humans ever used their right thumb to look around, or their left thumb to walk? I really hope you appreciate the amount of effort and skill it takes to properly use a controller to play a video game, which then later on in life might translate directly to things like operating heavy machinery, flying airplanes, all sorts of things where we're using our hands and our fingers to operate something that is outside of ourselves. And then we're just talking about using a controller, and we haven't even talked about what specific games can teach us. Over the last 30 years, I've played thousands and thousands of different video games, and I've even played them semi-professionally. At quite an early age, I got interested in basic programming and web design. I programmed my first website in a programming language called HTML, using a very basic framework. It probably had around half a dozen different pages, and it was nothing to write home about, but it was still very fun to do nonetheless, even though probably no soul in the world except for myself knew of its existence. And fast forward a few years and a website was online that focused on publishing news about video games on a semi-regular basis. This website actually became larger over the years, and at its peak it had thousands of members, quite an active community and around 6 or 7 students, including myself, actively writing for it. I believe, if my memory serves me well, over 10,000 articles were written for that website over the course of its lifetime. We had contacts with the largest video game publishers in the world and got sent review copies of video games before they actually came out, just to write about them. Which at that time was quite the effort, because I remember I had to actively negotiate with these publishers in order to convince them that we were worth their time and trust to receive those copies in the first place. And this didn't always work out, so there were some specific publishers that we didn't have an active relationship with. But it was great to have the ones that we did. It was something we were all very proud of. All of those students liked it as well, because now they could get some free games in return for writing an interesting review for the website. It was a great experience, and it was my first experience in a kind of leadership position where I had to keep other students motivated and engaged. Although, to be quite fair, I found that it wasn't very hard when you promise them free video games. That usually tends to work on teenagers. And for context, nobody got paid for it at all, because obviously it was a hobby for all of us. But it was my first experience in a leadership position, and it taught me to write properly. It taught me responsibility, because once I received those games, the publisher who sent you a copy might give you an embargo, which means you can't talk about it or share any footage. But you also had a responsibility to write up a decent and honest review and publish it before a certain date. I never signed any non-disclosure agreements or anything like that, but it was just a gentleman's agreement that you had with them. And obviously we wanted to keep the pipeline of free video games open as wide as possible, so we always honored those agreements. This was all a great experience, and it provided some really useful skills. And one thing that's important to mention here is that this was my primary way of learning back in that time. And this is also a point where the story gets really painful for me personally. But I feel it is necessary to point out, because this is an example where my love of video games overshadowed what was really important at that time. In that time, and it was probably around 2002 back then, in Netherlands you would be in 8th grade, when you were around 10 years or 11 years old. This was the last grade before you would leave primary school to secondary school. The way it worked back then is that you had to complete what they called a CITO test, C-I-T-O, which would then be used to help define to which secondary education you should go. The day we had that test, I walked to school. And I had a Game Boy Advance with me, with the game Spider-Man, Mysterio's Menace. This was for when I was done with the test, so I had it with me just so I had something to do when I finished the test faster than the rest of the class. Nothing in particular was on my mind that morning, it was just a day like any other. I didn't understand the gravity of the test, or what it meant, and what significant impact it would have. Had I known in advance and realized this, there was just no way I would do anything else than just study as hard as I possibly could. And I'm not sure why I didn't realize, because I didn't pay enough attention when it was explained beforehand, or because the teacher wasn't explicit enough about it, or because of anything else. But for me, I was 10 or 11 years old, and all I knew was that there would be some kind of test, but nothing big or important, just a test like any other, so I didn't really give it any thought. The class started. We got a test in 2 sets of paper. One set contained all the numbered questions, while the other set contained all the corresponding numbers with 4 open boxes next to each number, box A to box D, of which one had to be marked as the correct answer. I got bored really quickly and decided to randomly fill in these boxes, so I could signal to the teacher that I was done, so I could play Spider-Man on my Game Boy Advance. The fact that I was just so much faster than the rest of my class apparently didn't raise any alarm bells, because no intervention or check took place. Apparently finishing a test like that in 15 minutes was the most normal thing in the world. I was just playing the game, and that was that. I won't go into too much detail here, but this decision to fill in these boxes completely randomly destroyed my education. On the educational side, I have never recovered from this, and it led me down a path that I don't wish upon anyone. My point here is that video games are wonderful, and I don't hold them responsible for any of this. But there is a time and a place for them, and this wasn't it. And for this mistake, I have paid dearly. Next to that video game related event that ruined my education, there might also be a video game that might have saved me on a whole different front. And this is the last part I would like to talk about in this episode. And that game is Silent Hill. Silent Hill is a survival horror game from Japan. It's about a fictional abandoned town called Silent Hill. And in that town, a thick fog covers the streets and different monsters roam around to attack the player on sight. In the game you play Harry Mason, who, as he drives into town together with his little daughter Cheryl, crashes and then wakes up later with his daughter gone. You then go around the town looking for her, meeting interesting characters and fighting monsters along the way. Silent Hill is legitimately one of the most terrifying games ever made. At least the first 4 games that the original development team created before they were discontinued by their parent company. And at that time, when I first played that game on the original PlayStation, I was probably around 10 years old. I told you the game was one of the most terrifying game franchises ever made. But as a 10-year-old, I didn't really still fully appreciate the reason why that was, even though I knew it was. And yes, obviously I was way too young for this game. Silent Hill contains some very graphic images and themes that are absolutely not for children, but I still got my hands on it. And even then, even though it was incredibly terrifying and probably gave me nightmares as well, it was one of my favorite games and still is to this day. Its heavy and deep industrialized music and realistic sounds are incredibly unnerving. The atmosphere is just so oppressive. You would be on your toes the whole time, especially because of the static noise your radio in the game would make if there were monsters nearby, hiding in the fog just waiting for you to come closer. It was an incredibly tense game, but I loved it. And fast forward to my adult life, where I first realized just how deep and psychologically meaningful Silent Hill actually is. I won't go into too much detail here, as this would definitely deserve a full podcast episode of its own, maybe even multiple, but there are a few key facts to keep in mind. 1. Silent Hill is covered in a thick fog. 2. The state of the world switches between 2 dimensions constantly. The fog world and the other world. And the other world is a much darker and more dangerous version of that world. And 3, you cannot leave Silent Hill, because all the roads leaving town are cut off. The official guidebook of Silent Hill says that the fog in Silent Hill is the line between dream and reality. And it also says it isn't that one is reality and one is dream, which refers to the fog world and the other world. The fact is that neither is reality. Now, there's a whole lot going on in Silent Hill, but this is one of the most interesting things to me. The fog is not reality, yet is being experienced as such. And in that fog, there are monsters that want to hurt you. And there is no way to escape Silent Hill. All the roads leaving town are cut off. This concept has obsessed me for years, and it's still something I think about on a regular basis. Think about this for a second. Could it be that entering Silent Hill is like entering your subconscious? And that everything seems to be real, just as a nightmare seems real to you when you're in the middle of it, even though it is not reality? And could it be that the fog symbolizes the mind not being fully clear, and that the monsters hiding in the fog symbolize underlying psychological trauma? If a person is being tormented by something, because of something they did or because of trauma that they have experienced, their mind will probably not be kind to them. There will be monsters, and those monsters need to be fought. And sometimes, when things become too much, and everything around us becomes more unclear as we fall deeper into that state of unconsciousness, that's where we enter the other world in Silent Hill. That darker and much more dangerous place that will break us if we don't do the right thing. But once we've done the right thing and have taken care of the problem at hand, we allow ourselves to transition back into the fog world. I find this absolutely fascinating. The idea that what you see around you is just a projection of your subconscious. Absolutely brilliant. And this is just one aspect, but like I said, I'll leave it for its own episode. Video games are wonderful. Yes, there's much wrong with the industry as a whole, and there are many challenges in all sorts of different ways. But video games allow us to connect to each other in a state of play. They allow us to engage with wonderful stories, learn from them, be inspired by them, and sometimes, in very rare cases, they might even change the way we think. Thank you for listening, and as always, take care.